Hi, my name is Tijana, and today I'll be talking about individual privacy accounting via Rényi filter, and this is joint work with Vitaly Feldman. So this talk is about privacy loss composition, and this is certainly one of the most fundamental problems in the theory of privacy-preserving data analysis. At a high level, privacy loss composition analyzes how privacy of an individual degrades as the number of analyses using their data grows. So this is the usual setup. We have some data set of individuals, and we run some analysis on this data set. We get an output A1. Then we feed this output into the choice of the next analysis to run. We get another output. Then we feed the first two outputs into the choice of the third analysis to run. We get an output, and so on. And the goal in this setup is to bound the privacy loss of the overall composed algorithm in terms of the privacy losses due to individual algorithms. And this is useful because, on one hand, this simplifies privacy-preserving algorithm design. So usually we can break down a complex algorithm into simpler subroutines, and then we can ensure that the overall algorithm is private by only ensuring that these simpler subroutines are private. And this also allows individuals to participate in multiple disjoint statistical analyses, all the while knowing that their privacy will be preserved. And specifically, we will be focusing on differential privacy. And there are really many composition theorems in the literature on differential privacy. And while they differ in certain aspects, they generally also share one limitation, and that is the fact that all of them summarize each algorithm in the composed sequence using a single privacy parameter. So a typical composition theorem in the literature might look something like this. We say if AT is epsilon t differentially private for all t, then the composition of A1 through AK has a differential privacy parameter that's equal to the sum of these epsilon t's. So in the context of the diagram that we had previously, we would associate each of these algorithms in the sequence with a single privacy parameter. And then to compute the overall privacy parameter, we would just add these parameters up. But note that this approach is implicitly ignoring any difference between individuals in the analyzed data set. And specifically what I mean by that is epsilon t bounds the worst case effect implied by the removal of the most extreme hypothetical point. So in particular, the privacy loss divergence is bounded by epsilon t for any possible hypothetical data set S and for any possible hypothetical individual that we could remove from this data set. So our starting observation is that this certainly ensures that the worst case individual loses at most epsilon t privacy, but quote unquote, typical individuals might actually lose a lot less, because certainly different individuals have different effects on the outcomes of statistical analyses. Say that we have a database of individuals and we have their salaries in the database, and suppose that we want to report the average salary in this database. Then if we remove an individual that has a salary that's very close to the average, that will have very little effect on the final report, meaning that if we remove that individual, the final report will be pretty much the same. Similarly, if we're running gradient descent, and we look at the list of gradients for all the points in our data set, then if there's a data point whose gradient is very close to zero, this point will have very little effect on the final gradient step, which means that we can remove this point without actually changing anything. So at some intuitive level, we feel that certain individuals that have little effect on specific analyses don't actually lose a lot of privacy by participating in those specific analyses. And in this work, we turn to individual privacy counting to formalize that. In particular, we propose a more fine-grained approach to privacy accounting by evaluating the effect of the specific data points that we have in our analyzed data set on the analyses that we run. And we call these effects individual privacy losses of points xi incurred by applying the algorithm AT. So previously, in the previous diagram, we want to apply some analysis. Then what we would do is we would actually keep track of a different privacy loss parameter for each individual in the analyzed data set. And we would do this for every analysis that we run. And by doing so, by tracking these individual privacy losses, we can actually provide a tighter analysis of privacy composition. So now I want to set this problem up a bit more formally. Specifically, we will be talking about Rényi differential privacy. And note that by using standard conversions between RDP and DP, our results will also have implications to epsilon delta differential privacy. Specifically, the main notion of individual privacy loss that we'll be dealing with is the following. So we will say that an algorithm AT satisfies alpha rho Ti individual RDP for point xi if this inequality right here holds. So in particular, we're looking at the Rényi divergence between an output and the same output that we would report if we remove a specific point xi rather than any arbitrary point xi. And it's important to remember that these parameters rho Ti by themselves do not imply any reasonable privacy guarantee. So in particular, this parameter rho Ti depends on the value of xi itself. So it shouldn't necessarily be interpreted as a privacy guarantee. And so to give one example, if algorithm AT is a gradient query, so we want to sum up all the gradients and add Gaussian noise, then this algorithm will satisfy alpha rho Ti Rényi differential privacy for xi, where this rho Ti parameter is proportional to the squared norm of the gradient for that specific point xi. So in particular, the loss depends on the realized gradient and not some hypothetical worst case bound, which would often be implied by, say, a clipping parameter. Okay, so now how do we do composition with these individual privacy losses? Well, the challenge is that we want to compute the effect of a specific data point on a specific analysis, but the specific analysis in adaptive composition is determined adaptively. So in the example that I just gave in gradient descent, the individual privacy loss depends on theta t, which is the current optimization iterate, but this current iterate is adaptively determined in the process of optimization. So therefore, we need to understand composition with adaptively chosen privacy parameters in general. And this setting was first introduced in the context of epsilon delta differential privacy by Rogers, Roth, Ullman, and Madan in 2016. And here the authors define a privacy filter, which is essentially a stopping rule that ensures that a pre-specified privacy budget is met. And so now I'll sketch basically how a filter operates. So in the following sketch, you should think of B as the overall differential privacy budget. And all parameters epsilon t are actually chosen adaptively, possibly as a function of all the previous reports. So the analyst would first pick a privacy parameter epsilon 1 and an algorithm A1 that is epsilon 1 differentially private. And then we would feed this privacy parameter into the filter, which outputs continue or halt depending on whether the privacy budget B is potentially violated. So if it outputs continue, that means that we can safely proceed with the computation and our privacy will be preserved. So we run the analysis, we get an output. Then the analyst chooses the following privacy parameter epsilon 2 and an algorithm A2 that satisfies epsilon 2 differential privacy. Now we would feed the first two privacy parameters into the filter. Let's say that it again outputs continue. We get an output. And the third step, let's say that the filter again outputs continue. And then at the fourth step, suppose that the filter actually outputs halt. So that means that the composition should end after step 3. And so what this valid privacy filter ensures is that the overall output of composition will be differentially private. And note that the number of reports that we get in the end is random because these privacy parameters that we choose at every step are also random. Okay, so in our work, our main ingredient is a new composition theorem for Rényi differential privacy that allows adaptive privacy parameters in general. And this is what the result says. So fix any b and alpha, and suppose that AT is alpha rho t Rényi differentially private, where rho t is an arbitrary function of the previous reports, A1 through AT minus 1. Then if the sum of these privacy parameters is upper bounded by b almost surely, then the adaptive composition is alpha b Rényi differentially private. And note that this statement is essentially a filter for a Rényi differential privacy, because what it says is that stopping based on the sum of RDP parameters is a valid stopping rule. And importantly, it recovers the standard composition result for RDP despite adaptivity and privacy parameters. So as in usual composition of RDP, we simply just add up all the privacy parameters. And this is important because we can then invoke standard conversions between RDP and DP. And this will imply a filter for epsilon delta differential privacy as well. And it allows reproducing any rate for advanced composition of epsilon delta differential privacy that relies on Rényi-based privacy notions. So in particular, this RUV rate that I previously mentioned allows adaptive privacy parameters. And asymptotically, it behaves like the advanced composition theorem of Dwork, Rothblum, and Vadam from 2010. Of course, the advanced composition theorem only holds for fixed privacy parameters. But this rate of advanced composition from 2010 has subsequently been improved using Rényi-based privacy notions. So for example, Ban and Steinke in 2016 provide a more sophisticated analysis that relies on concentrated DP, and they get a better rate for advanced composition. And so what our result essentially implies is that these stronger rates that rely on Rényi notions are also valid under adaptively chosen privacy parameters. Okay, but now let's go back to individual privacy accounting. So in our work, we apply this RDP filter to design an individual privacy filter. And now I'll sketch what this object actually is. So in the following sketch, let B denote the overall RDP budget of order alpha. So first, we would want to apply some analysis A1 on our data set. And we would compute the individual privacy loss for all points in the data set. And we would see whether this individual privacy loss is less than or equal to B, or if it exceeds B. Let's say that in the first round, all of them are less than B. So our filter continues. So we just make a report. In the second step, we check if the sum of the first two individual privacy parameters is less than or equal to B. Again, let's suppose that all of them are really less than B. So we can simply run the analysis. And now let's say that in the third step, for one data point, the sum of the first three individual privacy parameters actually exceeds this value B. Then what we would do is we would just drop this individual from the analysis and make the report using the remaining individuals in the data set. And again, let's say in the fourth step, again, one individual exceeds the budget B. We would drop that individual from the data set and make the report using the remaining individuals in the data set. And so we can keep going like this. And what the individual privacy filter ensures is that the overall output is guaranteed to be alpha B Rényi differentially private. And note that this approach is no more conservative than standard non-personalized accounting methods, because the individual privacy parameters are no more conservative than the usual worst-case privacy parameters. And importantly, individual privacy filtering can also be implemented in the local DP model. So now I want to illustrate one application of individual privacy filtering, and that is an application to private gradient descent. So the standard approach to running private gradient descent is to clip the gradients and add Gaussian noise. And this is how the algorithm roughly goes. So we initialize the first iterate arbitrarily. And then for k-sequential rounds, we first compute all the gradients at the current optimization iterate. Then we clip all the gradients to have norm at most c. Then we add noise to these gradients. And finally, we just take a gradient step. So now what individual filtering allows is for us to use the fact that not all gradients will have norm at least c before clipping, but some of them will actually have norm less than c, so we actually don't have to perform any clipping. And we can use this leftover clipping budget, essentially, and perform additional optimization steps with such data points. And so in particular, we don't need to run necessarily k rounds, but the individual filter will drop points adaptively when their total squared gradient norm hits the pre-specified privacy budget. So to conclude, in this work, we propose a tighter privacy accounting method by tracking personalized privacy loss for every data point in the analyzed data set individually. And our individual privacy filtering approach is, first of all, no more conservative than usual worst-case approaches. It is often very simple to implement, for example, in the case of linear queries. And it can also be implemented in the local model. The main tool in our analysis is a new privacy filter for Rényi differential privacy, which generalizes the standard composition result for RDP when the privacy parameters are adaptively chosen. And this filter also implies an improved filter for epsilon delta differential privacy by applying standard RDP to DP conversions. And with that, I thank you for your attention.